What does the future of American foreign aid look like after the Trump administration shut down USAID? Former DOGE staffer turned State Department official Jeremy Lewin sat down with Russ Douthat of the New York Times to discuss the subject.
Lewin argues that the U.S. was hurting its relations by pressuring other countries to adopt America's identity politics and run their countries similar to ours. He says the U.S. is now proposing a different model. Let's listen.
Our model is to take what was a dependency-based sort of foreign assistance for the NGO complex, et cetera, and turn it into something that is a more appealing, more humane version of the sort of bilateral relationships that China has been offering successfully, eating our lunch all around the world. And so that's what's going to define the next stage of American investment in the world. What we believe in, the way that you are going to have human flourishing in your country, and if you sort of look on a scale, what has led to more development, life expectancy, well-being, sort of human utility around the world than economic development. That's the cornerstone of everything.
Lewin also echoed Secretary of State Marco Rubio's sentiment that, quote, the best foreign assistance is that which ends. Instead, Lewin argues that the U.S. should build countries economically so that they can be bilateral partners.
Douthat pressed Lewin on whether the U.S. should continue programs like PEPFAR, which combats diseases like AIDS around the world, and continue to battle malaria. Here was Lewin's response.
The Secretary has been very clear that we're continuing to spend on PEPFAR and on malaria and on high-impact health programs.
But the administration wants to spend less money on treating some of... Right,
No. I think when you look at what PEPFAR was spending its money on, those cuts, very modest amount of money that was cut from PEPFAR, was not for direct treatment, treating people with HIV and stuff like that. It's on sort of like LGBTQ, education programs or whatnot.
Some on social media criticised Lewin over his stances. MSNBC analyst and host of the Bulwark podcast, Tim Miller, wrote on X, a 1980s cartoon villain reincarnated as a DOGE staffer talks to Douthat NYT about why the Trump admin wants to eliminate food and medical aid for the lucky people that are taking advantage of us. I thought this was an interesting discussion, Amber. I didn't think, I don't really think it's quite fair to sort of say cartoon villain. He's making different arguments to that. What I found sort of frustrating about it was the host, the New York Times columnist, was raising, I thought, genuinely interesting questions about whether the Trump administration ever sees humanitarian aid as a good in itself, or whether it believes in that aid as a way to burnish the image of the United States and therefore hold off other global rivals, notably China, when it comes to the developing world. And the DOGE turned State Department young guy didn't really go for that at all. To my mind, he sort of took refuge in these ideas about the what he calls the global aid complex and things like that, of which he's obviously skeptical. But I didn't think he really engaged with some of the more interesting questions raised on that podcast.
Yeah, and Ross Douthat is sort of known for getting into those philosophical underpinnings of where politicians stand on issues. We saw that in his interview with Vice President J.D. Vance, for example. But I do think it should be appreciated that we finally have this long-form explanation of what exactly is going on at the State Department regarding the continuance of some aid programs and the ending of others, because there's been a lot of sort of short statements from Secretary of State Marco Rubio and then a lot of speculation in the press and not much clarity from the officials themselves about what exactly is happening. So just on a baseline level, the fact that this interview happened, I think, is fantastic. Getting into some of the things that were said outside of these sort of philosophical questions, I appreciate the Trump administration's approach to the idea that the best aid is the aid that eventually ends. We obviously want countries around the world to be self-sufficient. If you're going into an aid program with the idea that it is going to last forever, then you make them dependent on you, which can be a form of soft power, a country always being dependent on you, but is it what's best for the people? So I actually think in that answer, he does kind of answer the question, which is that they actually do think it's a good in of itself because he's talking about actually lifting people out of the conditions such that the aid is necessary.
I think that the argument that sometimes aid can be endlessly self-perpetuating, I think there are instances where that can be true. But some of the juxtapositions that Lewin made in his argument, I found really rather dubious. And we actually played one of them in the clips there. When he's talking about PEPFAR and AIDS, he essentially says, well, we haven't cut the money that goes to treating people with HIV or AIDS, but we have cut money that goes to other things like LGBT education. And in the fuller clip, or in the full podcast, the New York Times columnist then shoots back, understandably, saying, well, actually, I mean, if you're trying to combat AIDS, and we know that gay men in particular are a at-risk population for AIDS, then it makes sense then to devote some of those resources to education on that topic about things like safer sex and all of that. So I think that sometimes when it did go into those more interesting areas, I didn't find the responses terribly impressive.
Yeah, I think the PEPFAR debate is an interesting one because we are talking about a program that was never meant to be permanent, right? It was an emergency program developed in the 90s in order to combat this global AIDS crisis. And so then the question becomes, well, is PEPFAR the right vehicle to provide preventative treatment, or is it always intended to provide direct treatment for people who have AIDS or HIV? And I think that's kind of what they're getting at there. And there are former PEPFAR officials who have talked about the program and mentioned that over time, one of the things that they were able to do was actually build up the capacity within countries such that they can provide that direct treatment themselves and provide that education themselves. And so PEPFAR's programming dollar amount has actually been relatively flat over the past 10 years or so because they've been able to build up those local resources. So I think that's actually more of a test study of what is being talked about by this DOGE turned State Department staffer, of the idea that if you are able to give resources and education to those countries, eventually you can start to pull that back.
Yeah, you mentioned just a few moments ago how Ross Douthat, whose last name I constantly mispronounce, so
Don't we all?
Apologies to him, but he does get into these sort of more philosophical areas. And at one point, Lewin talks about what are American values as opposed to these sort of global values. And he's then asked, well, what are these American values? Like, for example, to take PEPFAR as an instance, do you think that the combating of AIDS and HIV in foreign countries is something that should be done? Do you think it is in America's interest to do that? Or do you think it's kind of charity that is sort of debatable whether it's necessary or not?
I view it more as charity that's debatable because I think the number one priority of any sovereign nation should be the welfare of its own citizens, the welfare and safety of its own citizens. Anything outside of that is generally extra and sort of a bonus. And I'm not sure I necessarily buy the soft power argument. And we almost got into this in a recent episode, but we didn't get much time, which is that we've seen that in countries where we have massively increased our aid and our interest in their development, that their views of us have actually declined while their views of China have increased more positively. So if the whole goal is to combat China's influence around the globe with American influence, it doesn't seem that the way we've been doing it is necessarily working.
Yeah, I mean, this would be a longer discussion. Maybe we'll have a whole segment devoted to that. I mean, I'd just say, correlation is not necessarily causation, sure, right? And there could be many other factors as to why people perceive the United States positively or negatively in whatever way.
Very true. All right, up next, Trump's DOJ filing an official complaint against a judge that's no stranger to being in the administration's crosshairs. What's next for Judge James Boasberg coming up? Stay with us.